The sharp, rhythmic scrape of a worn straw broom against rough concrete echoed through the damp, sweat-scented air of the downtown boxing club. It was 11 p.m. in one of Detroit's most neglected outskirts, and the facility was mostly empty. Neon lights from a fading sign outside buzzed lazily, casting flickering shadows over the blood-stained canvas of the central boxing ring. The air carried the heavy, unmistakable residue of raw ambition, leather gear, old linoleum, and generations of desperate fighters trying to punch their way out of poverty. Marcus the Anvil King moved with slow, deliberate precision. At 48, his massive 6'3" frame was built like a stone monument, his shoulders broad and corded with thick, dense muscle forged from decades of intense physical labor. He wore a faded gray janitor's jumpsuit with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that resembled heavy iron beams. His short, graying buzz cut and neatly trimmed beard framed a face that looked as though it had been chiseled out of obsidian. Across his dark skin, a prominent, jagged silver scar ran from his left temple down across his cheekbone, a permanent physical signature of a dark night 15 years ago. To the young amateur fighters who frequented the gym during the day, Marcus was just the quiet, invisible old black man who emptied the trash, mopped up the sweat, and rewrapped the heavy bags. He never raised his voice, never offered unsolicited advice, and never looked anyone directly in the eye. They saw a broken, weary laborer who had succumbed to the weight of the world. They had no idea that beneath that faded jumpsuit beat the heart of an undisputed king. 15 years ago, Marcus King was the heavyweight champion of the world. He was an absolute titan who possessed a devastating punching power and a brilliant, tactical boxing IQ that defense analysts still studied in hushed reverence. But his reign had ended not by a knockout in the ring, but by a betrayal in the shadows. When a powerful world-class gambling syndicate commanded him to throw a multi-million-dollar championship bout in Las Vegas, Marcus had flatly refused. He chose his integrity over their blood money. The retaliation was brutal. A staged accident on a rainy highway left his vehicle destroyed, his left knee permanently shattered, and his career obliterated overnight. The syndicate had systematically blacklisted his name, erased his historical records from the athletic commissions, and forced him into hiding. Marcus had traded his championship belts for a broom, disappearing into the underbelly of Detroit to protect the only thing the fire couldn't touch. His infant son, Elijah, Marcus, finished sweeping the perimeter of the ring and paused, leaning his heavy hands against the wooden handle of the broom. His piercing amber eyes turned toward the center of the canvas. There, bathed in the sharp, solitary beam of a single overhead spotlight, 19-year-old Elijah Cole was moving in total silence. Elijah was the perfect image of his father in his youth, athletic, muscular, with an explosive agility that made him look like he was floating above the canvas. His dark skin was slick with sweat, his jaw clenched in absolute concentration as his wrapped fists sliced through the air in perfect combination bursts, jab, cross, hook, slip. Marcus watched his son, his chest tightening with a complex mixture of profound pride and intense anxiety. He had tried to steer Elijah away from the sport, knowing firsthand how corrupt and dangerous the business could be. But the warrior spirit was carried in the blood. Elijah didn't fight for fame or luxury. He fought with a desperate, burning hunger to lift his father out of the grueling janitorial shifts that had aged Marcus before his time. "Keep your chin tucked on the exit." "Elijah," Marcus said softly, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that carried an unyielding authority despite its quiet tone. Elijah instantly stopped mid-motion, dropping his fists and turning toward his father with deep respect. He wiped the sweat from his brow with his forearm, breathing heavily. "Like this, Dad?" Elijah asked, executing a rapid slip-and-counter move. Keeping his jaw shielded behind his shoulder, Marcus nodded slowly, placing the broom against the corner post. He stepped onto the apron and slid between the ropes, his left leg dragging slightly, a silent reminder of the price he had paid for his honor. He approached his son, his large, scarred hands reaching out to gently adjust the positioning of Elijah's elbows. "The moment you throw the right cross, your left shoulder becomes your shield," Marcus instructed, his eyes locking onto Elijah's with an intensity that burned like hot coals. "The world out there doesn't fight clean, son. They look for the blind spot. They look for the moment you think you've won, and that's when they try to take your head off. You must always protect your house." "I know, Dad," Elijah replied, his voice determined as he looked into his father's eyes. I'm ready. The city tournament begins next week. I'm going to win that title, and I'm going to get us out of this place. You won't have to sweep another floor again. Marcus placed a heavy, calloused hand on his son's head, pulling him into a brief, powerful embrace. He closed his eyes, praying silently against the darkness of the city. He had sacrificed his crown 15 years ago to keep Elijah safe from the monsters of the underground. But as he looked at the raw talent radiating from his son, he knew the past was no longer content to stay buried. The battle was coming to their doorstep, and this time, he wouldn't be able to fight it from behind a broom. He would have to become the anchor at the corner of the ring. The single bare bulb hanging from the cracked plaster ceiling of their small apartment flickered, casting long, dramatic shadows across the worn linoleum floor. It was nearly 1 a.m., but the exhaustion that weighed on Marcus King's broad shoulders seemed to vanish the moment he stepped into their cramped living room. He quietly dropped his canvas duffel bag by the door, trying not to disturb the silence of the night. But he instantly noticed that the small wooden kitchen table had been pushed entirely against the wall. In the center of the clearing stood Elijah. The young man hadn't even showered yet. His knuckles were still wrapped tightly in white athletic tape. Now slightly grayed from the dust of the gym floor, he was completely focused, his eyes fixed on an imaginary opponent as he executed a series of lightning-fast shadowboxing movements. Snap, snap, roll. His bare feet made a soft, rhythmic slapping sound against the floor. Marcus didn't interrupt. He walked over to the small kitchen counter, poured himself a glass of tap water, and leaned his massive frame against the sink, watching silently. He could see the dedication radiating from his son's every movement, but he also saw the small, almost unnoticeable flaws that a civilian eye would miss. A fraction of a second delay when recovering from a heavy left hook, a slight drop in the guard when moving laterally. In a standard amateur bout, these flaws wouldn't matter, but Marcus knew that next week, the stakes would be infinitely higher. Elijah was no longer fighting for hobby points. He was stepping into an arena built on predatory interests. Elijah threw a final, explosive uppercut into the empty air, exhaling sharply through his teeth, and finally caught sight of his father. He stopped, his shoulders dropping as he offered a weary but eager smile. Hey, Dad. I thought I'd get a few more rounds of shadow boxing in before crashing. My stamina feels good, but my timing, it feels just a little bit off when I try to exit the pocket. Marcus set his glass of water down with a soft click. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he unrolled the long sleeves of his gray janitor's shirt, stepped forward into the makeshift clearing, and planted his feet into a classic, rock-solid defensive stance. Show me, Marcus said, his deep baritone voice carrying a calm, untouchable command. Throw the standard jab-cross-hook combination, full speed. Don't pull your punches. Elijah hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at his father's graying hair and the old injury that caused him to lean slightly to the right. Dad, I don't want to hit you. You've had a 12-hour shift. You won't hit me, son, Marcus interrupted gently, a faint, rare spark of a champion's confidence flickering in his amber eyes. Square up, Elijah breathed out, his expression shifting into absolute focus. He brought his wrapped hands up, tucked his chin behind his lead shoulder, and advanced. With a sudden burst of explosive athletic power, Elijah launched the combination. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The air whistled as his taped fists flew toward his father's face. But Marcus didn't move his feet. With the impossible fluid economy of motion that had made him an undisputed legend 15 years ago, he casually parried the jab with a microscopic deflection of his right palm, slipped the right cross by a mere millimeter as it grazed past his left ear, and caught the roaring left hook effortlessly in the dense palm of his scarred left hand. The impact made a loud, sharp slap echo through the quiet apartment before Elijah could even register that his combination had been completely neutralized. Marcus's right hand flashed forward, stopping a mere hair's breadth away from his son's exposed jawline. It was a flawless counterattack. Executed with zero wasted energy, Elijah froze, his eyes wide with absolute astonishment. He slowly dropped his hands, looking at his father as if seeing him for the first time. How did you do that? I was moving at full speed. I didn't even see your hand move. Marcus lowered his fist, his expression returning to its usual serene, protective calm. He reached out, gently tapping the side of Elijah's wrapped wrist. You are moving with your muscles, Elijah. You were relying on your youth and your speed. But speed is an illusion that fades when you meet an opponent who can read your intentions before your brain even sends the signal to your arm. Marcus sat down at the wooden table, beckoning his son to sit opposite him. Elijah pulled up a chair, hanging onto his father's every word. When you threw the jab, your right hip twitched backward by a fraction of an inch, Marcus explained, his large, scarred fingers tracing a line on the wooden surface to illustrate the mechanics. You gave me the blueprint of your attack before you even threw the punch. In the streets of Detroit or on the canvas of a championship ring, a smart fighter doesn't watch the fists. He watches the breath. He watches the weight distribution in the knees. He reads the soul of the man standing across from him. Elijah looked at his father's scarred face, the jagged silver line across his cheekbone burning under the dim yellow light. Is that how you became the champion, Dad? By reading their souls? A heavy, solemn shadow passed over Marcus's amber eyes, the memories of crowded arenas, roaring crowds, and the ultimate betrayal of the syndicate flashing briefly behind his gaze. I became the champion because I refused to let anyone else dictate my worth, Elijah. And that is exactly what I am going to teach you this week. For the next 2 hours, the small apartment became a sanctuary of elite tactical boxing knowledge. Marcus didn't teach his son how to punch harder. He taught him the sacred geometry of the ring. He showed him how to cut off the canvas using subtle footwork, how to manipulate an opponent's rhythm by changing the speed of his breath, and how to turn defensive slips into devastating counter angles. It was a masterclass that money couldn't buy, a pure, unadulterated Dai-san passed down from a hidden king to his heir in the dead of night. As the digital clock on the microwave shifted to 3 a.m., Marcus stood up, placing a heavy, warm hand on Elijah's shoulder. That's enough for tonight, son. Go get some rest. Next week, the city tournament opens its gates, and the world is going to see what happens when the ashes of the past finally catch fire. Elijah stood up, his heart pounding not from exhaustion, but from a profound, unshakable inspiration. He looked at his father, his chest swelling with determination. I won't let them take it from us, Dad. I promise. Marcus watched his son walk down the narrow hallway toward his bedroom. Left alone in the quiet kitchen, the old heavyweight champion looked down at his scarred, calloused hands. He closed them into powerful, iron-like fists, his jaw tightening as he looked out the small window toward the dark, neon-lit skyline of the city. The storm was rising on the horizon, but this time he had built an immovable anchor to face it. The air inside the Detroit Starlight Arena was thick with the scent of stale beer, cheap cigars, and the electrical hum of television broadcasting equipment. It was the quarterfinals of the City Boxing Championship, and the venue was packed to maximum capacity. The crowd was a roar of white noise, screaming names and flashing signs, but inside the ring, 19-year-old Elijah Cole felt as though he were moving through a vast silent ocean. Snap, slip, angle. Elijah blinked away a bead of sweat, his eyes perfectly locked onto the chest of his opponent, a heavily favored, aggressive brawler from the city's eastern district. The brawler lunged forward, throwing a vicious, looping overhand right aimed directly at Elijah's jaw. To the untrained eye, it was a knockout blow. But to Elijah, the attack was broadcast in slow motion. He saw the slight drop in the opponent's lead hip, felt the shift in his weight distribution, and heard the sharp intake of breath a fraction of a second before the punch was even thrown. Applying his father's midnight lessons, Elijah didn't panicking or retreat. He executed a microscopic slip to the left, letting the heavy fist graze the air millimeters from his ear. In the exact same motion, using his tucked left shoulder as a rock-solid shield, he rotated his hips and delivered a lightning-fast right cross, straight through the opponent's exposed blind spot. Crack. The impact was surgical. The brawler's eyes rolled back, his knees buckling instantly as he collapsed heavily onto the blood-stained canvas. The referee didn't even bother to finish the 10 count. He waved his arms, declaring a technical knockout victory. The arena erupted into a thunderous, deafening roar, but Elijah simply turned toward his corner, standing just behind the ropes. Clad in his faded gray janitor's jumpsuit with a white towel draped over his broad shoulder, was Marcus King. The old champion offered a single, slow nod of approval, his amber eyes reflecting a quiet pride that meant more to Elijah than the cheers of 10,000 strangers. Together, the father and son had systematically torn through the tournament bracket, leaving a trail of unconscious favorites in their wake. However, High above the roaring crowd inside a soundproof glass-enclosed executive VIP suite, the atmosphere was chillingly cold. Silas Thorne stood with his hands resting against the thick glass, peering down at the central ring with a pair of calculating, snake-like gray eyes. Silas was the shadow ruler of Detroit's underground sports scene, a ruthless gambling kingpin whose multi-million-dollar syndicate secretly manipulated fight margins, corrupted athletic commissions, and decided which fighters were allowed to touch glory. Dressed in an immaculate, pinstriped designer suit and wearing gold rings on his manicured fingers, Silas had watched Elijah's final combination with an absolute, frozen intensity. "Run the footage back," Silas commanded, his voice a low, raspy hiss that made his assistants in the suite instantly rigid with anxiety. "Zoom in on the kid's footwork and the angle of his counterslip." A technician quickly tapped at a sleek digital console, projecting a high-definition slow-motion replay onto the wall-sized monitors behind the desk. Silas stepped closer, his jaw clenching tightly as he watched Elijah neutralize the overhand right. It wasn't just standard boxing technique. It was a highly specific, inimitable defensive geometry. The way the young boy used his lead shoulder as an impenetrable shield, the microscopic economy of motion during the slip, and the devastating, unyielding power generated from the hip rotation, it was a precise tactical signature. It was the exact flawless style of the anvil. Silas felt a ghost from 15 years ago slam directly into his chest, his face draining of all color. "Bring me the registration records for this kid, Elijah Cole," Silas growled, his voice vibrating with a sudden volatile undercurrent of rage. "Look up his family background, his address, and who signed his medical release forms." Within 2 minutes, an assistant scrambled back into the room, holding a tablet with a trembling hand. "Sir, the boy enters the tournament under an open athletic scholarship. His mother passed away years ago. His legal guardian and trainer is listed as Marcus Cole, a maintenance worker at the downtown boxing club." The technician pulled up a hidden surveillance photo taken from the arena's security cameras earlier that evening. The image showed a graying, rugged black man in a janitor's uniform, carrying a water bucket near the corner of the ring. Even with the gray hair and the deep lines of hard labor etched into his face, the prominent, jagged silver scar running across his cheekbone was a lethal, unmistakable confirmation. "Marcus King," Silas whispered, a dark, predatory sneer stretching across his mouth as the memories of his greatest public humiliation flooded back into his mind. 15 years ago, Silas Thorne had bet his entire reputation and tens of millions of dollars on a championship fight in Las Vegas, commanding his star fighter, Marcus King, to take a dive in the third round. But Marcus had defied him, shattering Silas's empire with a single, devastating knockout punch before disappearing into thin air. Silas had spent over a decade hunting for the ghost, systematically erasing his records and burning down his past, yet the champion had been hiding in plain sight, quietly forging an heir right under his nose. Silas slowly turned away from the glass window, a cruel, malicious smile illuminating his face under the dim light of the suite. The old grudge had Trolli, and this time, he had the ultimate leverage to finish what he started 15 years ago. "He thinks he can use his son to win back his honor." Silas chuckled dryly, the sound devoid of any real humanity. "We own this tournament. We own the referees, we own the judges, and we own the arena. If Marcus wants his boy to fight in the finals next week, he's going to play by my rules. Call our enforcers. It's time to pay the janitor a little visit." The cold rain of Detroit pelted the metal fire escape outside the small Brooklyn-style apartment, creating a harsh, erratic metallic tapping that masked the footsteps approaching the door. Inside, the apartment was warm, filled with the rich aroma of a simple home-cooked meal Marcus had prepared for his son. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, meticulously cleaning his leather boxing gloves, his mind focused on the upcoming championship final. Marcus stood by the counter, his massive shoulders relaxed for the first time all day, watching his son with a quiet, grounding presence. Suddenly, the heavy wooden front door didn't just rattle. It splintered slightly under a heavy, forceful kick. Before Elijah could leap from his chair, 3 broad-shouldered men in dark tactical leather jackets strode into the living room. They moved with the cold, arrogant authority of hired muscle, their hands resting ominously near the waistbands of their jeans. Following behind them, Stepping carefully over the threshold to avoid the damp floor was a man whose presence immediately made the small room feel suffocatingly small. Gavin Vance, the chief enforcer for Silas Thorne's multi-million-dollar gambling syndicate, stepped into the light of the single blinking bulb. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and wore a sharp-tailored suit that contrasted sharply with the worn linoleum of the apartment. He adjusted his gold cufflinks, his gray eyes scanning the room with open disdain before settling directly onto Marcus King's scarred face. "Marcus King," Gavin said, his voice a smooth, low hiss that carried a venomous edge. "Or do you go by Janitor Cole these days? I must admit." The boss was shocked to find out that the Anvil was still pulling a paycheck sweeping up sweat in the slums of Detroit. Elijah stood up instantly, his wrapped knuckles clenching into tight, powerful fists. "Who the hell are you? Get out of our house." Gavin didn't even look at the young man. He merely waved a dismissive hand, and two of the heavy enforcers moved forward. Placing themselves between Elijah and the table, their frames blocking the path like a physical wall, Marcus didn't move. He stood firmly against the kitchen sink, his amber eyes burning with a terrifying protective steel resolve. He placed a single, large, calloused hand on Elijah's shoulder, a silent command that forced his son to stand down. "Silas sent you." Marcus forced the words out of his raspy, damaged throat, the sound deep and heavy like stone grinding against stone. "The boss sends his regards." Gavin replied, a cold smile stretching across his mouth. He stepped forward and dropped the leather briefcase onto the small wooden kitchen table, sliding it directly toward Marcus, and he sends a choice. Gavin popped the brass latches of the briefcase, revealing neat, thick stacks of rubber-banded $100 bills. $100,000, Marcus. Cash advance. This is your son's official compensation for the championship final next week. All Elijah has to do is look real good for 2 rounds, and then take a dive in the third. Just lay down on the canvas and let the Eastern District boy take the belt. Elijah's face twisted into absolute fury. "We don't take bribes. My dad didn't teach me how to fight just to sell out to cowards like you." Gavin laughed dryly, a sound completely devoid of any real humanity. He snapped the briefcase shut, the loud click echoing through the silent room. "You're a talented kid, Elijah, but you're naive. You think this tournament is about merit? We own the commission. We own the referees. We own the judges, and we own the arena. Your victory tonight was allowed because it raised the betting margins for the finals. Next week, the house always wins." Gavin leaned in closer to Marcus, his voice dropping into a sharp, poisonous whisper that stripped away all polite pretense. "And if the money isn't enough motivation, let me tell you what happens if the boy decides to be a hero like his old man. The commission has already flagged Elijah's medical urine sample from tonight. If he doesn't cooperate, a random doping test will come back positive tomorrow morning. His scholarship will be permanently revoked, his career will be destroyed, and he'll be barred from amateur sports for life." Marcus's jaw clenched so tightly the chiseled muscles looked ready to rip through his dark skin. The silver scar across his temple flushed red under the dim light. "Furthermore," Gavin continued, tapping his gold ring against the table with a slow, agonizing rhythm, "the boss remembers Las Vegas, Marcus. He hasn't forgotten the millions you cost him. If your boy doesn't stay down in the third round, my men won't just hit him. They will break his wrists and shatter his knees right there on the canvas, under the blind spot of the cameras, before the referee even calls a break. He will never hold a boxing glove, let alone a broom, for the rest of his pathetic life." The brutal threat hung heavily in the air, thick with explicit cruelty and generational malice. Elijah looked at his father, a cold spike of fear hitting his chest for the first time, not for his own safety, but because he saw the terrible weight of the choice his father was being forced to make. Marcus King slowly stood up to his full height, his massive 6'3" frame casting a terrifying, immovable shadow over the billionaire's enforcers. He didn't pick up the bribe money. He didn't launch into a chaotic, volatile rage. He merely raised his large, scarred left hand, pointed a firm, iron-like finger directly toward the open door and forced a low, icy rumble from his chest. "Get out of my house," Marcus whispered, his amber eyes burning with an intense, absolute power that caused Gavin's enforcers to unconsciously step back toward the exit. Gavin's face hardened into a cold, lethal glare. He picked up his briefcase, straightened his designer jacket, and turned on his heel. "You have until the opening bell next week to decide, Janitor. If the boy doesn't drop in the third, you better prepare to carry him out in a box." The enforcers retreated through the splintered doorway, slamming the door behind them, leaving the small apartment in a suffocating, ringing silence. Elijah dropped back into his chair, his hands shaking slightly as the full weight of the syndicate's power pressed down on him. "Dad, what are we going to do? They own everything. If I fight to win, they'll ruin my career or break my hands." Marcus walked over, his left leg dragging slightly against the linoleum as he approached his son. He placed both of his massive, powerful hands firmly onto Elijah's shoulders, his amber eyes locking onto his son's with an unyielding, unbreakable warrior spirit. Marcus raised his scarred fingers, executing a series of rapid, precise sign language gestures that carried more tactical force than a shout. "They think they own the arena, Elijah, but they do not own the fighter. We do not run from the storm. We fight through it." He looked down at the gray tape on his son's hands, his jaw tightening into iron resolve. The dirty game had begun before the hour G. But Silas Thorne had completely forgotten one crucial detail from 15 years ago. An anvil does not break when you strike it, it shatters the hammer. The deafening roar of 30,000 spectators inside the Detroit Starlight Arena converged into a chaotic storm of white noise, vibrating the concrete foundation of the stadium. Blindingly bright, multicolored spotlights swept erratically across the arena, illuminating a sea of high society gambling high rollers, sports journalists, and rowdy fighting enthusiasts shouting out betting margins. Above the ring, the heavy modern digital display monitors broadcast the fight live across the nation, displaying the championship final title. But down inside the blue corner of the ring, 19-year-old Elijah Cole felt entirely isolated, trapped inside a heavy, suffocating silence. Elijah sat heavily on the small wooden stool, his athletic frame breathing heavily, chest slick with sweat and streaks of fresh blood. His jaw was bruised, and a violent swelling had begun to form beneath his left eye. For 2 consecutive rounds, he had been subjected to a brutal, institutional processing. His opponent, a towering and savage Eastern District slugger heavily backed by Silas Thorne's gambling syndicate, had systematically executed a dirty fight strategy. The slugger had landed repeated, illegal low blows, headbutts, and excessive elbow strikes during the inside clinches, yet the referee, whose pristine white uniform was pristine and crisp, deliberately turned a blind eye. Every time Elijah attempted to speak or request a fair warning, the official stepped in with an aggressive gesture, breaking the clinch while allowing the slugger to land a free, unguarded hook. The 3 ringside judges sat in a calculated row, systematically marking down points against Elijah, forcing him into a corner. The entire infrastructure of the tournament was a beautifully orchestrated mechanism designed to force the young fighter to buckle, to crush his resilience before the start of the 3rd round. Elijah looked up past the ropes, his bloodshot eyes searching for an anchor. Standing directly on the canvas apron, completely unbothered by the mocking shouts of the front-row high society patrons, was his father. Marcus King stood like an unyielding stone monument in his gray janitor's jumpsuit, a water bucket resting near his scuffed leather boots. His amber eyes were clear, steady, and entirely devoid of panic, looking down at his son with an absolute, unshakable warrior presence. He's hitting low, Dad," Elijah rasped, spitting a thick stream of blood-tinted saliva into the plastic bucket. Marcus held up his hands, wrapped tightly in gray athletic tape, were shaking slightly against his knees. "The referee isn't calling anything. The crowd? Everyone wants me to drop. I feel like I'm fighting an entire army alone in this corner." Marcus slowly stepped between the ropes, his left leg dragging slightly against the blood-stained canvas as he approached his son. He knelt down on one knee, his massive frame blocking the prying lenses of the television cameras, creating a private sanctuary of tactical serenity right in the center of the roaring arena. Using a damp white cloth with his large calloused hand, Marcus gently and deliberately wiped the blood and sweat from Elijah's bruised face. His movements were slow, grounding, and full of a father's profound devotion. "Look at me, Elijah," Marcus commanded, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated beneath the white noise of the stadium. He gripped his son's shoulders with his powerful hands, his gaze locking onto Elijah's eyes with an intensity that burned like hot coals. "They think they have cornered you. They think because they bought the whistles and the scores they have bought the outcome of this fight, but they cannot fight the rounds for him. Your body is whole, your spirit is clean. Remember the geometry of the house. But the third round is next, Dad, Elijah whispered, looking across the ring at the slugger, who was grinning arrogantly while Gavin Vance smirked from the VIP perimeter. That's when they told us to take the dive. If I don't lay down, they're going to break me. Marcus's jaw tightened into iron resolve, the jagged silver scar across his cheekbone shifting under the harsh spotlight. He leaned in closer, his lips millimeters from his son's ear as the warning buzzer sounded for the final round. Let them try, son, Marcus whispered, a dark, predatory lethal confidence radiating from his entire being. The dirty game ends this round. I have spent the last 2 rounds reading his soul. I know exactly where the blind spot lies. Now stand up and let the anvil shatter the hammer. The opening bell for the third round chimed with a sharp, historic finality across the Detroit Starlight Arena. The massive crowd erupted into a chaotic, volatile frenzy, with thousands of spectators leaning over the railings, expecting to witness the final, systematic destruction of the underdog freshman. Silas Thorne sat back inside his glass VIP suite, a cold triumph illuminating his gray eyes as he watched the fighters advance toward the center of the ring. Elijah Cole stepped forward, his posture appearing intentionally cautious, his guard held low and slightly loose. To the corporate talent scouts and the corrupted referee, it looked like the young boy was finally succumbing to exhaustion, ready to accept the syndicate's script and take the dive. The Eastern District slugger lunged forward with absolute arrogance, a wide, predatory sneer stretching across his heavy face. Relying completely on the bought protection of the official, he abandoned all defensive discipline. He unleashed a massive, brutal left hook aimed at Elijah's injured eye, followed immediately by a devastating overhand right designed to end the fight with maximum violence. But as the heavy fists traveled through the air, Elijah heard his father's voice echoing inside his mind like an absolute tactical command. Every time he throws the left hook, his weight shifts 3 inches too far onto his lead knee, his right elbow flares out, creating a perfect 3-second blind spot in his defense. He isn't watching the breath, he is watching his own victory. Change your rhythm, Elijah. Let him think you are broken, with an impossible fluid economy of motion inherited directly from the anvil. Elijah executed a microscopic defensive shift. He dipped his torso low to the right, letting the roaring left hook graze past his dark curls by a hair's breadth. He didn't retreat. As the opponent's overhand right followed, Elijah didn't panicking. He planted his bare feet firmly onto the canvas, transformed his tucked left shoulder into an absolute stone shield, and waited for the exact microsecond of the opponent's hip rotation. From the corner of the ring, Marcus King stood perfectly still, his amber eyes locked onto the central spotlight with an unblinking intensity. He didn't shout, he didn't wave his arms like an amateur coach. He simply raised his large, scarred hand, his fingers executing a single rapid, precise gesture in sign language, the ancient command for the execution of the counter-strike. Elijah caught the signal through his peripheral vision. The doubt completely vanished from his soul. With a sudden, explosive athletic power generated entirely from his core and hips, Elijah launched the final definitive combination. He drove a devastating left shovel hook directly into the slugger's exposed ribs, forcing the air out of the man's lungs with a loud gasp. Before the brawler could even register that his defense had been penetrated, Elijah rotated his shoulders with an unyielding, superhuman force and delivered a lightning-fast, surgical right cross straight through the opponent's blind spot, connecting directly with the point of the chin. Boom. The sound of the impact was like a physical crack of thunder echoing off the limestone architecture of the stadium. The slugger's eyes instantly rolled back into his head, his consciousness completely evaporating before his body even began its descent. He collapsed forward, his massive frame hitting the canvas with a dull, heavy thud, his mouthpiece slipping from his lips and sliding across the blood-stained floor. He lay perfectly motionless beneath the blinding white light of the spotlight, completely unconscious. The entire Starlight Arena went entirely, suffocatingly quiet save for the hum of the television cameras, the thousands of high society gamblers, the corporate executives, and the judges sat with their mouths open in sheer, unadulterated shock. The referee stood frozen over the fallen fighter, his hands dangling by his side, his face an ash-gray mask of absolute panic as the pre-written script of the syndicate was torn to shreds on national television. Elijah Cole didn't look at his fallen opponent. He stood tall in the center of the ring, his chest heaving, his chin held high with absolute, unshakable dignity. He slowly turned toward his corner, his wide eyes locking instantly onto his father's silhouette. Marcus King stepped onto the apron, a brilliant, proud smile finally breaking across his rugged face as he reached out his scarred hands to receive his son. The old heavyweight king had spoken through his heir, and the arena of the corrupt had just witnessed the resurrection of an untouchable legacy. The deafening silence that initially frozen the Starlight Arena shattered into an absolute, uncontrollable uproar. 30,000 spectators leaped from their seats, their faces illuminated by the chaotic flash of cameras and the blinding overhead spotlights. On national television, sports commentators lost their composure, screaming into their microphones as the massive digital display monitors replayed the final, devastating combination in hyper-slow motion. Nobody could believe what they had just witnessed. An unranked teenage freshman had just put an iron-jawed brawler to sleep with a single surgical strike. The down on the canvas, the Eastern District slugger remained completely unresponsive, his heavy frame surrounded by medical staff who had scrambled into the ring, high above the chaos, inside the glass-enclosed executive VIP suite. Silas Thorne stood completely frozen, his gray eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated shock, his manicured hands pressing so hard against the glass that his knuckles turned white. The multi-million-dollar betting margins he had carefully constructed were completely wiped out. Beside him, Gavin Vance was furiously screaming into his cell phone, his tailored designer suit disheveled as he realized the syndicate's absolute control over the tournament had just been torn to shreds. Inside the ring, the corrupted referee finally finished the compulsory count over the unconscious brawler, his face as an ash-gray mask of pure panic. With trembling hands, he was forced to step toward the center of the ring, grab Elijah Cole's wrist, and raise his arm into the air, declaring him the official champion of the city. Elijah didn't celebrate. He didn't dance or wave to the roaring crowd. His chest heaved as he stood tall with absolute, unshakable dignity. He immediately unbuckled his padded headgear, stepped across the blood-stained canvas, and leaned over the ropes into the blue corner where Marcus King was waiting. The old heavyweight king extended his massive, scarred hands, grabbing his son's forearms in a powerful grip. For 15 years, Marcus had kept his head down, sweeping up the sweat of younger fighters and living as a ghost in the slums of Detroit to keep his son safe from the wolves of the industry. But tonight, looking into Elijah's clear eyes, he knew the sacrifice had been vindicated. "We did it, Dad," Elijah rasped, tears of pure adrenaline and relief cutting through the blood and sweat on his bruised cheeks. "We broke their script. Your geometry, it worked perfectly." Marcus offered a deep, resonant smile, his amber eyes shining with an unbreakable warrior pride under the flashing stadium lights. He took the damp white cloth from his bucket and gently wiped a fresh streak of blood from his son's eyebrow, his large hand grounding the young champion amidst the surrounding madness. "You fought with your soul, Elijah," Marcus whispered, his raspy voice carrying a profound, absolute weight. "You showed them that the spirit of a true fighter cannot be bought or broken by their dirty games. But don't drop your shield just yet, son. The ring is clear, but the monsters are still in the building." Marcus turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze cutting through the brilliant spotlights of the arena to look directly up at the glass VIP suite. High above, Silas Thorne was already gesturing to a group of armed tactical enforcers, his face twisting into a lethal expression of vengeance. The syndicate had lost the betting margins, but they still held the corrupted athletic commission, the pre-stage doping files, and the power to destroy Elijah's life before he could even leave the stadium. Marcus adjusted the white towel over his broad shoulder, his jaw tightening into iron resolve. The overturned punch had won the title. But now it was time for the maestro to step into the light and deliver the final. The grand presentation ceremony inside the center of the ring was intended to be a celebration of corporate luxury, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The chairman of the athletic commission, an older white man heavily bribed by Silas Thorne, stood behind a microphone podium alongside several high society patrons, reluctantly holding the heavy golden championship belt. Gavin Vance stood just outside the ropes, a cold, predatory smile returning to his face as he whispered to a group of security guards who began to encircle the blue corner. Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman spoke into the microphone, his voice echoing over the stadium speakers. Before we officially award the city title, there is an administrative matter that must be addressed. The commission has just received an urgent biological flag regarding a mandatory medical sample submitted by the fighter Elijah Cole. Earlier this evening, we must temporarily withhold the belt pending a formal investigation into substance fraud. A sudden, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the thousands of spectators. Gavin Vance smirked, adjusting his gold cufflinks. The syndicate's trap had been sprung. They were going to strip Elijah of his Vin Quang, blacklist his name, and destroy his future right in front of the national television cameras. Elijah stepped back, his bloodshot eyes widening with a sudden spike of anxiety as the referee and two security guards moved to conche him. But before their hands could touch the young champion, a massive, towering shadow stepped directly between them. Marcus King slid between the ropes and entered the center of the ring, clad in his faded gray janitor's jumpsuit, his scuffed leather boots leaving a track of gray city mud on the canvas. He looked like a total anomaly amidst the elite evening suits around him. Yet, the moment he stood to his full 6'3" height, an untouchable, absolute majesty radiated from his frame. He gat-fanged the referee's hand away with a single, effortless motion of his powerful forearm, his amber eyes burning with a terrifying steel resolve. "Get away from my son," Marcus forced the words from his raspy throat, the deep rumble silencing the podium instantly. "Listen here, Janitor," the commission chairman snapped, trying to maintain his institutional authority. "You have no standing in this ring. Step down before security puts you in handcuffs." Marcus didn't back down. Instead, he walked directly up to the microphone podium, pushing the chairman aside with a slow, immovable strength. He didn't have a voice to shout, but he reached into his jumpsuit pocket, pulled out a compact, high-tech encryption tablet, a device he had kept secured for weeks, and plugged its auxiliary cable straight into the arena's central broadcasting console near the floor manager's desk. "What is he doing? Cut the feed, cut the cameras," Silas Thorne roared from his VIP balcony, his face twisting into absolute terror as he realized what was happening. But it was too late. Marcus pressed a single button on the screen. Instantly, the wall-sized digital display monitors hanging over the ring flickered. The slow-motion replays of the fight vanished, replaced by a crystal-clear, high-definition audio and video file that began to play live across 30,000 screens in the stadium and millions of homes nationwide. It was the surveillance footage from their apartment 1 week ago. Gavin Vance's face filled the giant screens, his voice echoing with devastating clarity through the stadium speakers. $100,000, Marcus. Cash advance. All Elijah has to do is look real good for 2 rounds and then take a dive in the third. If he doesn't cooperate, a random doping test will come back positive tomorrow morning. My men will break his wrists and shatter his knees right there on the canvas. The entire arena went completely suffocatingly quiet as the recording played. Then the file shifted, showing a series of leaked banking transactions and decrypted text messages between Silas Thorne and the commission chairman, detailing the exact bribe payments used to buy the referees and judges for tonight's final. The exposure was absolute, surgical, and final. Marcus had utilized the syndicate's own arrogance against them, tracking their digital fingerprints and recording their threats to orchestrate a complete systemic destruction on live television. You ruined me," the chairman whispered, dropping the golden belt onto the canvas as his knees buckled from pure terror. Down at the perimeter, Gavin Vance tried to sprint toward the exit, but a dozen heavily armed federal law enforcement agents, who had been waiting for the broadcast signal outside, burst through the stadium doors and tackled him directly to the ground. High above, the glass doors of the VIP suite were kicked open as federal marshals swarmed Silas Thorne, forcing the gambling kingpin onto his knees and clicking silver handcuffs around his wrists in full view of the entire audience. Marcus King turned away from the podium, completely ignoring the chaos around him. He picked up the heavy golden championship belt from the canvas, walked over to his son and gently buckled it around Elijah's waist. He raised his large, scarred fingers, executing a final series of quiet, proud sign language gestures that filled Elijah's heart with a profound warmth. "The house is secure, son. Your glory is clean. Nobody can ever tell you that you do not belong." Elijah threw his arms around his father's massive frame, Sobbing with a mixture of absolute relief and overwhelming pride, Marcus wrapped his powerful arms around his son, lifting his chin high as the remaining crowd, now realizing they were standing in the presence of an undisputed legend, erupted into a historic, thunderous standing ovation. The old heavyweight maestro had stepped out of the shadows of the boxing club, using his brain and his bond of fatherly love to destroy the syndicate and protect his son's future forever. As the father and son walked down the steps of the ring together, their heads held high, the faded gray jumpsuit no longer looked like the uniform of a laborer. It looked like the armor of a king who had successfully reclaimed his throne.